Step away from those boxes and put your hands where I can see them. Now!
Officer, I'm just moving into this house.
You can't afford this neighborhood. Turn around and get against the wall.
Officer, please don't do this. You're making a huge mistake.
Get your hands up or I'll tase you!
At exactly 9:30 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday night, Officer Jax Horton thought he was catching a burglar red-handed in an affluent neighborhood. What he didn't realize was that he had just pointed a taser at the one man in the city who could end his career with a single phone call. The man in the navy polo shirt wasn't just a homeowner. He was a 28-year veteran of the force and the city's brand-new police chief. In the next 15 minutes, stop would turn into a career-ending disaster that would leave the city's legal department scrambling to settle a nightmare they couldn't win. Before we see the moment the backup officers arrived and realized their lives were about to change, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because the fallout from this encounter is absolutely legendary. But for Stephen Benson, it felt like the start of a brand new life. Exactly 72 hours earlier, he had stood on a stage with his hand on a Bible. He had been sworn in as the city's first black police chief. It was a moment of pure joy and hope. For the first time in a long time, the people of the city felt like things might actually change. Stephen felt it too. He was 51 years old, and he had worked his whole life for this moment. Now, at 9:30 p.m., he was finally moving into his new home. The house was in a quiet, fancy neighborhood, with large trees and perfectly cut grass. It was the kind of place where people felt safe. Stephen was dressed simply in a navy blue polo shirt and khaki pants. He didn't look like a powerful official. He just looked like a man trying to finish a long day of work. He was carrying a heavy box labeled "Office" toward his front porch. His nephew Coulson was helping him unload the rest of the truck. Stephen took a deep breath of the cool night air. He looked at the streetlights glowing softly on the pavement. He thought about the meetings he would lead on Wednesday. He thought about the reforms he wanted to start. He was optimistic. He believed that the uniform stood for justice, and he believed his officers would follow his lead. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, his faith in the department would be tested in the most painful way possible. He didn't know that one of his own men was watching him from the shadows of a patrol car, waiting to prove how much work still needed to be done. Stephen Benson wasn't just some guy who got a fancy job because of luck. He was a veteran who had spent 28 years in law enforcement. He had started as a young officer walking a beat in the city's toughest neighborhoods. Over nearly 3 decades, he had earned dozens of awards and commendations for his bravery and his brains. Everyone who worked with him knew that Stephen was the real deal. He was the kind of leader who never asked his officers to do something he wouldn't do himself. People often asked him why he stayed in a job that was so difficult. They asked why he didn't go work for a private security company where he could make 3 times the money. Stephen always gave the same answer. He loved the law. He believed that the police could be a force for good if they were led the right way. He had spent his entire career breaking through glass ceilings. He was often the only black man in the room during high-level meetings. He had to be twice as good just to get half the respect. His salt and pepper beard and his steady eyes showed the world that he was a man of experience. He didn't need to yell to get people to listen to him. His authority was implied. He took the job of chief because he wanted to show young officers that excellence mattered more than anything else. He wanted to build a department where a person's character was the only thing that determined how they were treated. He had the medals and the rank to prove he was the best person for the job. But as he stood on his new driveway, he was about to learn that to some people, 28 years of service didn't matter at all. Stephen's mission wasn't just about his career. It was personal. He remembered a night when he was only 10 years old. He was sitting in the back seat of his father's car. His father was a hard-working man who always wore a suit to church and worked 2 jobs to keep the family safe. That night, they were pulled over by the police for no reason. Stephen watched through the window as 2 officers treated his father like a criminal. They were loud, they were rude, and they were scary. His father stayed calm. He kept his hands on the steering wheel and spoke with respect, even though the officers didn't show him any. When the officers finally let them go, Stephen's father looked at him in the rearview mirror. He didn't say anything, but Stephen saw the sadness and the hurt in his eyes. It was a look that Stephen never forgot. That was the night Stephen decided he would become a police officer. He didn't want to run away from the problem. He wanted to be the solution. He promised himself that he would be the change he wanted to see in the world. He wanted to make sure that no other 10-year-old boy had to watch his father be humiliated for just existing. Every time he put on his uniform, he was thinking of his father. Every time he wrote a report or led a team, he was trying to honor the man who stayed calm in the face of unfairness. He believed that by reaching the top, he could finally fix the system from the inside. He thought he had finally reached a place where he could protect people from the kind of bias his father faced. He was wrong. While Chief Benson was dreaming of a better future, Officer Jax Horton was stuck in the past. Horton had been on patrol for 12 years, and his career was going nowhere. He was a man filled with resentment. He had been passed over for promotions 3 times, and he blamed everyone but himself. He felt like the world was changing too fast, and he didn't like his place in it. Horton didn't see himself as a public servant. He saw himself as a warrior. To Horton, the city was divided into 2 groups, people like him and the suspects. He lived by a set of rules that weren't in any police manual. He believed that some people belonged in certain neighborhoods, and some people didn't. He prided himself on having street smarts, but in reality, his mind was clouded by prejudice. He spent his shifts driving through affluent areas, looking for anyone who seemed out of place. Horton was part of the old guard, culture that Chief Benson was hired to fix. He liked the power that the badge gave him. He liked the way people looked at him with fear when he pulled his cruiser onto the curb. He wasn't interested in community policing or making friends. He wanted to make arrests. On this Tuesday night, he was bitter and bored. He was looking for a win, something to prove he's still a tough cop who knew how to keep his beat clean. When his headlights hit a black man carrying boxes into a house at 9:30 p.m., Horton didn't see a neighbor. He didn't see a professional. He saw a target. Jax Horton wasn't just a bitter officer. He was a dangerous one. If anyone had looked closely at his disciplinary file, they would have seen a clear pattern of trouble. Over the years, 7 different citizens had filed formal complaints against him. Every single one of them was a black man who claimed they had been stopped, searched, or threatened for no legal reason. They described Horton as aggressive, insulting, and quick to reach for his weapon. However, in the department's old guard culture, Horton was a protected officer. Every one of those 7 complaints had been dismissed as unfounded or not sustained. His supervisors, like Captain Daryl Mann, liked that Horton was tough. They looked the other way when he bent the rules. They told themselves that Horton was just an aggressive cop who was doing the hard work that no one else wanted to do. This protection made Horton feel like he was untouchable. He believed he could do whatever he wanted as long as he wore the badge. He thought that the blue wall of silence would always have his back. Because he had never been punished for his behavior, he had no reason to change. He'd become bold in his bias. He believed that he was the law, and that anyone who challenged him was a criminal. He was used to picking on people who didn't have the power to fight back. He didn't realize that his streak of luck was about to run out. He didn't know that the man he was about to harass wasn't just another citizen. He was the one person who had the authority to pull back the curtain and show the world exactly what was in Horton's file. The clock on the dashboard of Officer Jax Horton's patrol car read 9:30 p.m. It was a slow night in the neighborhood, just the way Horton usually liked it. He drove slowly down the wide, clean streets. He liked looking at the big houses and the fancy cars parked in the driveways. To him, this area was a symbol of success and order. He felt it was his job to keep it that way. He believed that anyone who looked different was a threat to that order. He was looking for any reason to show that he was in charge. As he turned the corner, his headlights swept across a man standing in a driveway. The man was holding a large brown box. Beside him was a moving truck with its back door open. Horton's eyes narrowed. He didn't see a new neighbor. He didn't see a man moving into a new home. He saw a black man in an expensive neighborhood late at night, In Horton's mind, that could only mean one thing: Trebe. He didn't stop to think that maybe the man lived there. He didn't notice the official plates on the car in the driveway. His bias took over immediately. What is he doing here? Horton whispered to himself. He felt a surge of excitement. This was the win he had been looking for all night. He believed he was about to catch a burglar in the middle of a crime. He pulled his cruiser onto the curb, right behind the moving truck. He didn't turn on his sirens, but he kept his bright lights shining directly on the man. He wanted to startle him. He wanted to make sure the man knew that the police were here and they were watching. Horton stepped out of his car. He didn't walk. He marched toward the driveway. He kept one hand resting on his holster, right near his weapon. It was an aggressive move, designed to scare people. "You, put that box down right now," he shouted. His voice was loud and mean, cutting through the quiet night air. Stephen Benson did exactly what he was told. He set the box down slowly and carefully. He didn't look scared. Instead, he looked calm and very tired. He had dealt with officers like Horton for nearly 30 years. "Officer, there's no need to shout," Stephen said in a steady, deep voice. He stood up straight, his hands visible and relaxed. "My name is Stephen Benson. I live here. I'm just moving some boxes into my house." He spoke clearly, hoping the officer would realize his mistake and move on. But Horton wasn't listening. He didn't want to hear an explanation. He wanted to see a criminal. Horton stepped closer, shining a bright flashlight directly into Stephen's eyes. "I don't care what your name is," Horton snapped. "I asked what you're doing at this residence. We've had reports of suspicious activity." Stephen squinted against the light, but didn't move. "I understand you have a job to do, but I'm telling you, I am the owner of this home. Not only that, but I am your new boss. I was sworn in as the chief of police 3 days ago." Stephen reached slowly toward his back pocket to get his badge wallet. He wanted to end this quickly. He thought that showing his ID would solve everything. He expected the officer to see the gold shield and apologize, but he underestimated how far Horton's anger would go. Before Stephen could even touch his wallet, Horton reacted like he was under attack. "Don't move. Keep your hands where I can see them," Horton yelled even louder. He stepped into Stephen's personal space, trying to tower over him. Stephen stopped and raised his hands to his chest. "Officer, my credentials are in my pocket. I'm trying to show you who I am." He was still trying to be professional, but he could feel the tension rising. He saw the look in Horton's eyes. It wasn't the look of a cop looking for the truth. It was the look of a bully who didn't want to lose. "I'm not asking you again," Horton screamed. He grabbed Stephen's arm and tried to spin him around toward the patrol car. Stephen didn't fight back, but he didn't make it easy for Horton to push him either. He stood his ground like the seasoned veteran he was. "Officer Horton, I can see your name tag. You are making a very serious mistake. I am the police chief. I am ordering you to stand down and call your supervisor." Stephen's voice was like ice. It was the voice of a man who was used to being in command. Horton's face turned red with rage. He couldn't believe this man was still talking back to him. "Stop resisting," Horton shouted, even though Stephen was standing perfectly still. "I don't care about your fake stories. You're a suspect until I say you aren't." Horton didn't want to look at the ID. He was afraid that if he looked, he might find out he was wrong. He chose to double down on his lie instead. He pushed Stephen toward the hood of the car, forcing him to lean over. The badge that could have saved the city a fortune was only inches away, but Horton refused to see it. Horton wasn't going to handle this alone. He wanted the world to see him making a big arrest. He reached for the radio on his shoulder. His voice was breathless and urgent. "Dispatch, this is Unit 42. I have a suspicious person at 424 Oak Lane. Male is refusing to comply and claiming to be a department official. I need backup immediately, priority 1. He made it sound like he was in the middle of a dangerous fight. He was building a story that wasn't true, and he was doing it on a recorded line. Within seconds, the sound of sirens filled the neighborhood. 2 more patrol cars turned onto the street, their blue and red lights reflecting off the windows of the nearby houses. Officers Lionel Hollins and Rowan Graves jumped out of their cars before they even came to a full stop. They didn't ask questions. They didn't look at the moving truck were the police chief boxes. They saw Horton struggling with a black man, and their training told them to take the side of the fellow officer. It was the blue wall in action. "Get his other arm," Horton commanded. Hollins and Graves moved in quickly. They grabbed Stephen's wrists and pulled them behind his back. Stephen didn't struggle. He knew that any move he made would be used against him later. He just looked at the three officers with a look of pure disappointment. "Hollins, Graves," Stephen said, recognizing their names from the department roster. "Look at me. Look at my face. You know who I am." For a split second, Graves hesitated. He looked at Stephen's salt and pepper beard and his calm eyes. But Horton pushed him forward. "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to get out of a trip to jail." Just as the officers were about to click the handcuffs shut, a car pulled into the driveway. It was Stephen's nephew, Coulson Malone. Coulson was 24 years old and had just finished his shift at work. He saw the police lights and the officers surrounding his uncle, and his heart sank. He knew exactly what was happening because he had seen it too many times before. He jumped out of his car with his phone already in his hand, the camera recording everything. "Hey, what are you doing? That's my uncle. He is the chief," Coulson yelled. Horton spun around, his hand moving toward his taser. "Get back in your car. This is a police investigation. Interference is a crime." Horton was losing control of the situation, and it made him more dangerous. He saw Coulson as another threat, another suspect to be dealt with. He didn't see a young man who was rightfully worried about his family. "I'm not going anywhere," Coulson shouted back, keeping the camera pointed at Horton's face. "I'm recording this. You're arresting the police chief. You're all going to lose your jobs." The situation had officially escalated into a nightmare. Neighbors were starting to come out of their houses, standing on their porches and watching the scene. The quiet, upscale street was now a stage for a major conflict. Stephen looked at his nephew, then back at the officers. He could see that Hollins and Graves were starting to get nervous. They looked at the house, then at the moving truck, and then at the man in their hands. They were starting to realize that the burglar they were holding didn't look like a burglar at all. But Horton was too deep in his own bias to stop. He reached for his handcuffs and prepared to make the biggest mistake of his life. The quiet street of Oak Lane was no longer quiet. The bright flashing lights from 3 police cars bounced off the white fences and large windows of the expensive homes. Behind the curtains, the neighbors were watching. Lily Warner, who lived directly across the street, stood in her dark living room with her hands over her mouth. She had seen Stephen Benson moving in all day and knew exactly who he was. She couldn't believe her eyes. She grabbed her phone and started filming from her window, her hands shaking with anger. A few houses down, Ms. Mary Waters, a local middle school teacher, was also awake. She heard the shouting and the sirens and stepped onto her porch. She didn't stay back in the shadows. She wanted the officers to know they were being watched. "What are you doing to that man?" she called out. But the officers ignored her. What they didn't realize was that in this neighborhood, almost every house had a Ring doorbell camera. Those small, silent lenses were recording every second of the incident from different angles. They captured the way Officer Horton was screaming. They captured the way Stephen Benson was standing perfectly still with his hands up. They captured the moment the other 2 officers grabbed a man who was twice their level in experience and treated him like a common criminal. The neighbors didn't see a suspicious person. They saw a man being bullied in his own driveway. The digital evidence was stacking up, and it was the kind of evidence that could not be deleted or hidden by a blue wall of silence. The whole neighborhood was now a witness to a disaster. The sound of the first metal cuff clicking shut was the loudest noise Stephen Benson had ever heard. It was a cold, sharp sound that felt like a betrayal. For 28 years he had worn a badge with pride. He had spent his life protecting the law, and now the law was being used as a weapon against him. Officer Horton pushed Stephen's chest against the hood of the patrol car. The metal was cool against his face. He could feel the weight of Officers Hollins and Graves on his arms as they forced his wrists together. This was the ultimate humiliation. Stephen was a grown man, a leader, and a decorated veteran. He was being pinned down in front of his new neighbors and his own nephew. He could see Coulson's face nearby, filled with tears and rage. Stephen kept his eyes open, looking at the gravel on the ground. He didn't fight. He knew that any movement would give Horton an excuse to use more force. He chose to maintain his dignity, even while his hands were locked in steel. He was showing more strength by staying still than Horton was by using force. Horton leaned in close to Stephen's ear, his breath smelling like stale coffee. "Not so tough now, are you, Chief?" Horton whispered with a mean laugh. He felt like he had won. He thought he had successfully put a powerful man in his place. But Stephen didn't look broken. Even with his face pressed against a police car, he looked like a man in charge. He was memorizing every detail, the time, the badge numbers, and the words being said. He knew that while he was in handcuffs now, the roles would soon be reversed. The physical detention was a mistake that would haunt these officers forever. Just as Horton was about to lead Stephen toward the backseat of the cruiser, a fourth police car sped onto the street. It was Captain Daryl Mann, the watch commander for the night. Mann had heard the Priority 1 call over the radio and had rushed to the scene. He expected to find a dangerous burglar or a violent fight. He jumped out of his car and started walking toward the group, his hand on his belt. "Horton, what have we got?" Mann shouted as he approached. Horton looked up with a proud smile. "Caught him in the act, Captain. He's been resisting and giving us a fake story about being the new chief. We're taking him in now." Horton stepped aside so the captain could see the suspect. Captain Mann looked down at the man leaning against the car. He saw the navy blue polo shirt. He saw the salt and pepper beard. Then, he looked into the man's eyes. The color drained from Captain Mann's face so fast, it looked like he might faint. He felt a cold pit of horror open in his stomach. "Horton, what have you done?" Mann's voice was barely a whisper. He looked at Hollins and Graves, who were still holding Stephen's arms. "Get those cuffs off him, now. Do you have any idea who this is?" Horton blinked, his smile disappearing. "Sir, he's the burglar," he said. Mann didn't let him finish. He shoved Horton aside and reached for his own key. "This isn't a burglar, you idiot. This is Stephen Benson. This is the police chief." The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the clicking of the handcuffs being frantically unlocked as the officers realized their lives had just changed forever. The handcuffs were off, but the damage was done. Stephen Benson stood up slowly and rubbed his wrists. He didn't yell. He didn't even look angry. He just looked at Captain Mann with a cold, piercing stare that made the veteran captain want to look away. "Captain, secure their weapons and their badges," Stephen said quietly. His voice was steady, but it carried a weight that shook every officer there. "They are relieved of duty, effective immediately." Horton tried to speak, but Mann barked at him to shut up. The tough cop act was gone. Horton looked like he wanted to disappear. By now, the neighbors had moved from their porches onto the sidewalk. They were shouting questions and filming with their phones. Coulson was still recording, his face set in a hard line. He knew that the video he just took was worth more than words. Within minutes, the footage of the chief in handcuffs was already moving through the internet. It was going viral. People were sharing it with the caption, "New chief profiled on day 3. The department's reputation was melting away in real time. At 11 p.m., while he was still in his moving clothes, Chief Benson stood in front of his new home and gave a brief statement to a group of reporters who had rushed to the scene. He didn't talk about his own hurt. He talked about the system. "Tonight wasn't about me," he said into the microphones. "It was about a culture that allows an officer to see a crime where there is only a neighbor. This ends now." The city was in shock. The residents were angry. Everyone knew that a huge storm was coming for the police department. The morning after the incident, the city was on fire with news. The mayor held an emergency meeting and made a big decision. He didn't trust the local police to investigate themselves. He called the governor and demanded that the State Bureau of Investigation, or the SBI, take over the case. This meant the local old guard couldn't protect Horton anymore. By noon, Agent Kobe Cross had arrived at the precinct. He was a no-nonsense investigator who was known for being fair but very tough on corrupt cops. Agent Cross started by pulling Officer Horton's entire history. As he went through the records, he found something shocking that the local department had ignored for years. He found a 14-stop pattern. Over the last 3 years, Horton had stopped 14 different black men in this exact upscale neighborhood. In every case, he claimed they looked suspicious. In every case, the men were actually doctors, lawyers, or business owners who lived there. Horton had been targeting black professionals for years. and his supervisors had let him get away with it. The stakes were now much higher than just one bad night. This was proof of a systemic problem. Agent Cross looked at the stack of complaints that had been dismissed by Captain Mann and others. It was clear that the blue wall of silence had been protecting a predator in a uniform. The city was now facing a massive legal problem. People were already talking about a federal lawsuit. As Chief Benson sat in his new office, he realized his mission was no longer just to lead. He had to be the one to tear the whole system down and build it back from the ground up. Detective Lola Cobb sat in a small room with a tall stack of files. She was the lead investigator for internal affairs. Across from her sat the representative for the police union. The union man looked nervous. He kept tapping his pen on the table. He was there to protect Officer Horton, but even he knew the situation was bad. It was a high-stress situation, the union man argued. It was dark, and Horton thought he was stopping a crime. It was a split-second decision. Detective Cobb didn't blink. She pulled out a tablet and hit play on the Ring camera video. The neighborhood was quiet, and the chief was standing perfectly still. "Does this look like a high-stress fight to you?" she asked. She then laid out 14 other folders on the desk. Each one represented a black man Horton had stopped without a good reason. "This wasn't a one-time mistake," Cobb said. "This is a habit, and the habit ends today." The union's defense was falling apart. They tried to say that Horton was just being extra careful about the neighborhood. But Lola Cobb showed that Horton had ignored the official plates on the car and the badge in the chief's hand. She pointed out that Horton had even told the other officers to ignore the chief's words. The blue wall was finally crumbling. By the time the meeting was over, it was clear that the department could not protect Horton anymore. The evidence was too loud, and the truth was even louder. In the city's legal office, Salome Bloom was having a very difficult day. As the city attorney, her job was to protect the city's money. She looked at the videos from that Tuesday night and then looked at the mayor. "We cannot go to trial with this," she warned. "If a jury sees these videos, the cost to the taxpayers will be millions. This is a clear-cut case of profiling." The case moved into a federal courtroom, where Judge Lucille Hammond presided. She was a fair judge who didn't like it when the law was misused. One of the most important witnesses was a retired judge named Jared Water. He was an expert on police accountability. He stood before the court and explained exactly what had happened. When an officer refuses to look at a badge and ignores a calm citizen's rights, the law is broken, Water testified. He called Horton's actions a total failure of duty. Chief Benson sat in the front row, watching the legal process. He wasn't there for revenge. He was there for justice. Judge Hammond listened carefully to every word. She looked at the data showing the pattern of Horton's behavior. The city attorney knew they were losing. The defense was weak because the facts were impossible to argue against. The city was officially on the hook for what had happened in that driveway. It was no longer a question of if they would pay, but how much it would cost the city. The day of the termination hearing arrived. Officer Horton walked into the room without his gun or his badge. He looked smaller than he did on the night he had pinned the chief to the car. He tried to apologize, but it was too late. Chief Benson watched from the back of the room as the board reviewed the evidence. It took less than an hour for them to make a decision. Officer Jax Horton was fired. His career in law enforcement was over, and his name was added to a list of officers who could never work in the state again. But the trouble for Horton was just beginning. The State Bureau of Investigation had finished its probe, and they weren't just looking for a firing. They filed criminal charges. Horton was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law. This meant he had used his power as a cop to hurt someone's civil rights. The trial was short because the BodyCam footage showed everything. The jury didn't take long to find him guilty. Horton sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read. He realized that the blue wall he thought would protect him had turned into the walls of a prison cell. He had lost his job, his reputation, and his freedom. Officers Hollins and Grames were also fired for their roles in the detention. They had followed a bad leader without asking questions, and they paid the price for it. The message was sent to the entire department. If you violate the law, the badge will not save you. A few weeks later, the city held a massive press conference. City Attorney Salome Bloom stood at the podium and announced a record-breaking settlement. To avoid a long trial and more embarrassment, the city agreed to pay $595,000. It was a huge price to pay for 23 minutes of bad policing. The dumb cop mistake was now costing the taxpayers a fortune. Chief Stephen Benson stepped up to the microphone. He looked out at the rows of cameras and the crowd of people. He didn't look happy about the money. He looked determined. "This settlement is a receipt for a failure," he said. "But the real cost isn't the money. The real cost is the trust we lost with our community. My job is to earn that trust back." He announced that the settlement money would lead to new training programs and a special unit to review every single stop made by patrol officers. The story ended with a new beginning. Chief Benson stayed in his house on Oak Lane. He still saw Ms. Mary Waters and Lily Warner when he went for walks. He knew that the wound in the department wouldn't heal overnight. He had been a victim of the system he was now leading, and that gave him a strength that no other chief had. He turned a night of humiliation into a legacy of reform. The city paid the price in cash, but under Chief Benson's leadership, they were finally starting to build a department that treated everyone with the respect they deserved.